Well, good afternoon, everybody. This is Patrick from the Poison Pen Bookstore, and we're here with another of our virtual events. And today we have Mark DeCastrique joining us. I hope I got that name almost correct. DeCastrique, is that how you say it?
It was very good. You were halfway between North Carolina and Paris, which is perfect.
With this brand new book, Fatal Scores, latest in the Blackman Agency series. Welcome return. And
Thank you.
Barbara is tuning in from her home library today. It's always interesting to see what she's got up back behind her on the shelves there. But I'll be monitoring the Facebook feed here. So if you have questions for Mark, go ahead and put them in the comments field, and I'll mysteriously appear about 40 minutes in to ask any of your questions. So Barbara, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Patrick. What a treat to see you, Mark. It's been a while. I'm trying to remember when the last time you were in Scottsdale.
December of 2019 with Murder in Rat Alley.
Right. Was
Right,
that
one of the last things I did before the pandemic shut everything down?
I remember now. It came out at a strange time of year, and we did it in December, although your publication date was, I'm trying to remember, the end of December, early January. Was that the last Sam Blackman book before this one? It was.
Yes, it was.
And had a fabulous plot. I thought that was one of your most, I've always loved your plots for this series, but I thought that was a truly ingenious book.
Well, thank you. Part of it is, not knowing what the plot's going to be till you find out enough tidbits of history or might be history in Nashville to kind of draw from. And when I found out there was a NASA tracking station in the forest near Asheville, and also that all the nation's weather data is kept in Asheville, that sort of gave me the impetus to start trying to weave those two things together in that book. And I was pleased with the way it turned out.
I was delighted with the way it turned out. And it also turns out that if we'd saved it up till the Perseverance hit Mars, that we would have probably had a more, better platform for promotion. But honestly, I didn't even know that NASA had tracking stations like that, or that all the weather data was, as you say, located there, and what kind of a threat that could possibly be as climate change is accelerating.
Right.
I thought it was, in a way, it's a spy story as well as a murder mystery. But what it does, well, what Mark does so well, and why I love this series, is that it's centered on North Carolina, mostly on Nashville, but not always. It can wander around. But Mark has this wonderful way of weaving in real history and real people with these fictional characters. So we've been all over the place.
We have, and we've gone from the early 1900s up into just more recent times in Sam's journey.
So what focuses you on a particular character? We've had a photographer, we've had literary figures. The first book was Thomas Wolfe in Nashville, and we've been to visit, I always want to say Robert Frost, but that's not the right
Carl
book.
Sandburg.
Thank you. I get it wrong every time, Carl Sandburg. And in your other series, which I also really loved, your series with the police procedural series, I remember you were the one who first introduced me to the Vietnamese mountain people who had come to the United States, and the mountains of Appalachia were like home for them. And it reminded me of the Scots, when they had to leave the Highlands after Culloden and they came to the States, that the Appalachian Mountains the Great Smokies and all look more like home.
Yeah, those were the Montagnards who had really helped our servicemen in Vietnam and kind of now are displaced and being displaced. And I had read a newspaper in the article in the New York Times about a former general was lamenting the fact that he felt that our country hadn't treated them fairly, and that a lot of the special forces, particularly in the eastern part of the state, Fort Bragg, had worked with them, and they helped sponsor them to come to North Carolina. So I thought that was a tidbit I didn't know. And when you're working on a book, you're going to spend a year with it, so it may as well be something you find fascinating and would like to learn more about.
Absolutely true. Yeah, no, we've been with the Cherokee and the Trail of Tears. We've been all over. Tell us a little bit about that series before we talk about A Fatal Score and the Blackman Agency, because I miss it and I keep hoping you're going to revisit it.
Well, the series focuses on the main character. His name is Barry Clayton, and he's a funeral director in a small town in Western North Carolina. That idea came to me because my dad was a funeral director in a small town in North Carolina, and I spent the first couple of years of my life living in the funeral home. And I thought, that's an interesting character because the funeral home in a small town is sort of the place where all the stories come in, and the generations tell their eulogies as they're being served by the funeral home. And it's also where all the bodies come in. So it gave me it gave me an entrance into some things, and then my character is kind of in conflict because he doesn't want to be there. He planned to have a career in law enforcement because I wanted him to be interested in law enforcement, but his dad developed Alzheimer's early onset, and so he came back like the good son to help run the funeral home. So he partners up with a Vietnam War vet, Tommy Lee, who's the sheriff, who respects him, and they work together to solve cases. And it's a fun series to write. I kind of wandered into Sam because of an initial story that wouldn't work for Barry Clayton, and that I thought it was going to be a one only book, but my editor by the name of Barbara Peters told me, you're not finished with this character yet, and to keep working with him. And so that's how Sam sort of grew from a standalone into now the longest series that I do write.
Very true. Blackman's Coffin was that first book. And no, it wasn't a story that would fit Barry Clayton. But, Barry, I love the relationship between Barry and Tommy Lee. You write wonderful dialogue. You always remind me of Robert Parker. You have a great, you banter very well. And in fact, I really think that dialogue between Barry and Tommy Lee, in many ways, is the best dialogue that you write. I mean, Sam and Nicola in the Blackman Agency series, they bicker back and forth good-humoredly and so forth. But I think Barry and Tommy Lee really had something special going on. And then Barry's eventually develops a relationship with a local doctor. So adding even more, so now it's like a team. And he moves into formal law enforcement. He's not, he was a cop, and now he was running the funeral home. And that's such a sad dilemma for, a person living somewhere else with a career and then having a family, aging parents, and Alzheimer's striking one and making it almost impossible for the other person, in this case, Barry's mother, to care for this person alone.
Yeah, and one thing even in the first book in that series, what I hadn't realized when I had the father develop Alzheimer's is how the irony of the situation is that Barry is helping his fellow community members deal with loss and the celebration of their life, but meanwhile his dad is disappearing before his very eyes without that opportunity for losing one through a ritual of grief and through a funeral service and things that would help. I hate the word closure because you never close out people you love who have died, but it gives them a sense, I think, of peace to go through whatever their traditional service is for funerals.
Well, the tragedy is you lose the person before you lose the body.
Right.
And I think, you're right. Alzheimer's is a gradual erasure. I got a letter from the Mayo Clinic. My husband and I belong to the Mayo Medallion Program, and they send out some interesting information, and they're producing a book about treating Alzheimer's. They can't prevent it, but they're trying to find more treatments. And I do think that CRISPR and what we're learning about genetics may help that as we move along. Life is so much about timing, and disease, if you get it, is so much about where the medical community is in terms of treatment. Although we really have only learned to expect that over the last 120, 150 years. Before then, you just had to suck it up. And, if you had the plague before, they came around and nailed the doors and windows of your house shut. And, well, they did.
Right.
Left you there to die. When I was a kid in Winnetka, if you got measles or, mumps, one of the sort of traditional childhood illnesses, the Department of Health showed up, made you stay home and put a notice up on the door and monitored you. And, we never even thought about constitutional rights and protesting it. I can't figure out what happened.
No,
You know,
I know.
how do we go from that to people who really think that it's more important, you know, to have not to wear a mask than to endanger everybody else? I don't want to get off on a political rant, but it just drives me crazy when I think that we used to be together in that and accept it, and now everybody rebels against it. Not everybody, but enough people.
No, and it's even more insidious in the sense that because your refusal is endangering someone else's life. It's not like, you know, you don't want to wear a motorcycle helmet, and so you protest. Well, the only head you're going to crack open is your own, in that sense. But not wearing a mask is endangering all those around you, and I think that's, unfortunately, individualism can be taken to an extreme, just like anything else.
That's actually been our weakness in the pandemic, and I believe that American exceptionalism and individualism has not been our friend during this difficult time. But anyway, back to Barry. You've taken him along. You did a wonderful book involving food stamps and fraud that I thought was one of your more ingenious plots. But I missed Barry, so we must talk at some point about reviving Barry. But we're here to talk about Sam and the Blackman Agency, which, as you pointed out, began with Blackman's Coffin, which is a really wonderful book. And you enjoyed writing it. I was very interested in it. It had a lot of critical success. So I did urge you to continue to write Sam. But it has similar features to the Barry books. So, you know, it's not like you made a wild left turn. But Sam is an actual private eye. Tell us about his background, because he has a very interesting history.
Well, Sam is a wounded vet from the Iraqi War. He was a chief warrant officer because I wanted him to have investigative experience. But in Iraq, he was ambushed and lost part of his left leg, so he has a prosthesis. And the series starts with him in the VA hospital in Nashville, which is a real hospital, good sized veterans hospital. And he's coming to grips with his loss. You know, it's almost a sense of feeling about how is your wholeness as a person when you've lost part of yourself and have it replaced by a metal device. And he's in the hospital recuperating. And this Marine vet, a woman, African-American former sergeant in the Marine Corps, visits the vet. She has lost an arm herself, and kind of tells Sam to get up off of his butt and stop, you know, complaining and face life, grab life, because a lot of his buddies didn't come back at all. And she makes quite an impression on Sam in the very first chapter. And at the end of the first chapter, Sam's being discharged. He tries to look her up, and he finds out that she was murdered. And her sister, who is Nikayla, comes to Sam to ask him to help investigate. And one thing about Sam is he's like a dog with a bone, which I think good PIs are. They won't let something go. And of course, he runs afoul of the Asheville police because he's sort of saying they're not doing their job, implying that by the efforts that he has taken. And we find that there is a link between Nikayla's sister's murder and their great grandfather's murder almost 90 years before. And that grew out of the murder wasn't true, but the incident surrounding that murder came from a true story that I was told by a friend of my father's, who was, and I'll just tell that real quick, Barbara, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
He was 90 when I talked to him, and he told me the story of when he was a boy of 10 years old. He lived in a small town outside of Asheville called Brevard, and his father was the funeral director. And this is like 1918. And the African-American funeral director from Asheville came to his father saying, I'm trying to serve a family who needs to have their loved one buried in the family plot in North Georgia. And all I have are a horse and wagon to get there, and none of the white funeral homes will help me. Will you help me get this body down to the family plot? And so my friend's dad said they would. And so the boy went along, my friend went along with his dad and the black funeral director, and they had about an 8-hour drive down through the Jim Crow South. They couldn't eat together. They stopped at a family relatives of the deceased for lunch about halfway along the way. And when they walked in the little shanty cabin where they stopped, everything had been taken out of it, and the kitchen table had been brought in, set with 2 places, And the gentleman of the house who was their host said to my friend and his father, "You two will sit here and eat first. The rest of us will all wait out in the yard until you finish." And my friend's dad said, "There's no need to do that. So we've got room here at the table. We can all eat outside and have a picnic." And the man said, "No, you're doing a service for our family, and this is the way we want to honor you." And that story just stuck with me because I was looking at the man who'd been the little boy. I'd heard it straight from him. It was an indictment of the South, my South, in the way the Jim Crow laws were being enforced because they couldn't stop to eat together along the way as an integrated group. And then the other episode that I learned was Donald Lee, my friends told me, his dad told him, "Sometimes the only thing people have to offer you is their hospitality, and you always, always take it." And then there was the irony that they wound up eating there because they couldn't eat anywhere else, and they wound up eating not together but separately as well. So that was sort of the background history part that led me into the plot for Sam's first case. And I, like I said, I thought I had finished with him. You told me I hadn't. I'm glad you did. And we're now looking 7 books later after that first book.
Well, we are. The constants, I think, that we find, A, we're still in North Carolina. B, we're still mostly in Nashville, although, again, they've gone to other places. But I think of it as kind of Asheville-centric. And Asheville is a wonderful community. For me, it always says Grove Park Inn, which is really not all of Asheville, but I've always been so fond of it. It's a wonderful, wonderful hotel that was built. I think it was built during the Depression, wasn't it?
No, it was actually built in 1913.
Okay.
They had started but in 1913 by Grove, who had patent medicine for if it was Asheville, because Asheville was everybody came who had consumption back then. They called it consumption tuberculosis. They would come to Asheville for the mountain air that was looked to be rejuvenating and healthy.
Right,
for them.
like Switzerland, or
Right.
some of them came to Arizona. And you're absolutely right, because one of your books, F. Scott Fitzgerald, who, it was a 1920s thing. Right, but in any case, I don't know why I keep thinking of it as tied up with the Civil Conservation Corps from the Depression. Was there something built there? Was it the road or something? Why do I keep thinking it was involved in that? One of
I think you may be referring to the Blue Ridge Parkway that runs along the spine and goes just outside of Asheville, but goes all the way from Cherokee up into Virginia. And it's just a stunning, road
Right.
trip.
Well, yeah, I've driven it. So maybe you're right. Maybe that was just getting to Asheville that I was thinking about. But in any case, the inn is one of those places that has like a secret staircase and other cool stuff. But it's just a wonderful place to stay. But Asheville is very rich in literary tradition, and lots of interesting people lived in that area. And in this new book that we're here to talk about today, you've got Wilma Dykeman, who's really intriguing. Then you've got the Moog synthesizer guy, and I'm missing one. Aren't there 3 historical?
Yeah, Bela Bartok, the Hungarian composer.
That's it.
And then a cameo appearance, if you will, by Babe Ruth.
Yes, Babe Ruth and the baseball. Yeah, no, you got a lot into the story. But this is some of them have been, very much literary or other sorts of things, but this one is the not climate change, but ecological matters, namely the pollution of the Pigeon River and our polluted waterways, thanks to industrialization, is a major part of it. And that is a beautiful river that flows through that area. And there's a paper mill that is causing, or did cause anyway, this problem. So how did you pull all of these disparate things together? River pollution, Moog, Bela Bartok, Wilma Dykeman.
It started with the 4 characters who I realized had ties to Asheville that I hadn't realized before, and I wanted some way to kind of lift them up into a cohesive story. It was hard to do. You were my editor on that book, and as you have been in all the Sam Blackman books, and it took a couple of rewrites to kind of get it to gel right, so that wasn't so
Yeah, it's always the ending
compartmentalized.
with you. You know, it's never the beginning or the middle.
Right.
It's always the ending. And I've decided that it's because you write such complicated stories that it's not always easy to pull it together. And the truth is that a book to work has to have an end that delivers on the beginning. It has to have an ending that is as good as the beginning. And you're
Right.
just excellent at beginnings and you're decent at the middle, which is hard for a lot of people. But then you tend to wander towards the end.
I do. And fortunately, you know, I feel like I've been able to either be reined in or rein myself in to keep it a little more focused. But the Babe Ruth story was he's came there for exhibition games to play in Nashville, and came by train up from Florida after spring training. And on this particular day in 1925, he was on the train and had so much beer and so many hot dogs that when he stepped off the train in Nashville, he collapsed and had to be taken to a nearby hotel, and word went out that he had died. And so that went around the world that Babe Ruth had died in Nashville. And then later it was corrected. He had a just severe inflammation of his intestinal tract. And but it was called the bellyache that was heard around the world. So I got to work in some baseball trivia into the mystery actually itself. And then Bela Bartok had composed some work there in Nashville when he was recuperating from tuberculosis. And then Robert, actually, I always called him Moog. I learned in research that he had a plaque on his desk that said, "It's Moog to rhyme with rogue." So I've tried to correct myself to call it the Moog.
Yes, but nobody would know what you were saying. I mean, I thought about saying that, you know, Moog like rogue, but then I thought if I don't say Moog, nobody's really going to know.
That's right. That's right. He lost control of his own name, I guess. And he came to Asheville. He taught in the music department of Asheville and taught music technology, which was like the appropriate marriage for him between being the scientist and wanting to contribute to music. And he restarted his factory, and it's still there today. If you go to Asheville, you can sign up for a tour to go through the Moog factory. Wilma Dykeman was the one who was local to Asheville that I was not familiar with, I'm ashamed to say, since she was really in my own backyard. But she was an activist, an environmentalist. She wrote a book called The French Broad, which is another one of the major rivers that runs by Asheville. In 1955, this was 7 years ahead of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. And she also was an advocate for civil rights back in the 50s when that was not the popular stand to take in the South. So I really got to admire her the more I learned about her. And so the way we tied them together, I say we because you were part of that process, was created a fictional luminaries festival honoring for people with celebrity status that were tied to Asheville. And that gave me a vehicle in which to do it. And it's being sponsored by the owner of a paper mill. So it brought the two together. The pollution in the river, particularly the Pigeon River, North Carolina, is factual. It so polluted the river that the state did a study on what to do with the river, and the only thing they could come up with was that it was a deposit for toxic waste. It could not be any better than it was. And it flowed into Tennessee. People were dying in Tennessee from their groundwater and their well water, and their animals getting affected by the pollution. And one little town in Tennessee called Hartford became known as Widowville because there were so many deaths. And so I thought that was the serious spine of the book. And also it was done to get kind of into politics again. When EPA rules were being rolled back and pollution standards were being rolled back, I was concerned that we need to remember what we have been through once already and try to hold that standard as best we can. And so those are the elements that came together to make up the plot and the character development.
You always have a real mixed bag. I mean, that's one of the fun things about it. But you're right, they're creating a festival. It's interesting how, putting together something that is supposed to be charitable or civic oftentimes leads to the most appalling and destructive behaviors. I mean, you'd think that everybody be on their best behavior when they're trying to do something like that, but no, isn't always the case. So the Luminary Festival was really the only way you could reasonably knit all these things together, by giving people a claim to a piece of Asheville's history, or a piece of, whatever was going on. I thought it was a great creation. So have you thought up another interesting plot for Sam?
Yeah, I'm actually working on two things now. The Sam book, you know how it is with the character, you get worried about them. It's like with Barry Clayton. I'll probably go back to Barry just because I left him in a good place, but what's he been doing the last couple of years? You start to actually, kind of be concerned about your fictional friends. And Sam's plot, I was looking at what would happen. They're an interracial couple. Their stories have always tied some event in the past into a crime in the present. And where were they this last year? In COVID, in Black Lives Matter, in racial reckoning. And so I thought, I have Sam and I have Nikayla, an interracial couple. They're going to have a perspective on that. What do we do with a crime? Well, I came across FBI files, declassified files, on the two trips that Martin Luther King made to Asheville in the 1960s, in which there were threats on his life in both incidents. And I thought, wonder who those people were that made those threats, and how could they tie into my characters? And then I remembered that I had Nikayla be the last of her family because her sister was killed in the first book, but her father had also committed suicide in depression over the loss of his wife to cancer. And I thought, what if that wasn't suicide? What if that was actually a murder, and they find a way to link that story into what's going on in the present day? So that's what I'm working on. I'm probably about 85-90% through a first draft, and I'm at, like you said, I'm at the end where it's the difficult part of kind of tying all things up together. But I feel like I can see a glimmer of hope for being able to resolve things.
I'm happy to hear that. I'll look forward to seeing my email when it wanders my way. One of the things you did that I think, I mean, in a way it seems contrived, but in another way it solves a lot of problems for the author of crime fiction, is that back in Blackman's Coffin, you gave Nikayla and Sam a chance to be independently wealthy, which means that, I mean, they are principled anyway, but let's face it, it's easier to be principled and choose your cases if you are not actually scratching up a living in the process. And I don't want to give away for anybody who hasn't read Blackman's Coffin how that happened, but I do think that that gives them a latitude as investigators, professional investigators, that if they didn't have that kind of financial solidarity, they couldn't have. Did you plan that out, or did it just kind of happen as you wrote the book?
In Blackman's Coffin, I was worried about how he would and Nikayla would go forward. You know, if they stayed with the detective agency, actually, how much business would there be in the kind of cases that I wanted them to pick up? And you're right, I wanted them to pick up things that had merits and integrity and injustice at the heart of them, and not so much how much can the client pay. And so they don't make a big deal out of their money. In fact, most of their money is hidden offshore, which I had one reader criticize me for glorifying people sending their treasures offshore, and I had to write her back to say it's parked over there so they can come back into this country and do good things. But it gave them the latitude to be able to pick and choose. And in fact, in this new book, Sam is kind of torn because he winds up doing kind of an investigation into an affair that's going on, and he's kind of turned into a peeping Tom PI, which he really doesn't like being put in that position. That's not the kind of cases that he finds appealing or wants to be involved in, but the circumstances happened in this case.
Yeah, well, I mean, you know these people, and they might as well, they live in your house, so you can force them to do stuff like that. And also, that kind of money allows them to do pro bono things if they really want to. And in one of the books, they do take on a client who's clearly not going to be able to pay, or certainly not pay them at a level that would make any difference. But so I like that. It's a reason that in many golden age mysteries, you wound up with an investigator who, Father Brown, whose livelihood came from the church, Lord Peter Wimsey, who inherited loads of wealth, Mr. Campion, who never had a particularly clear background, but nevertheless was clearly like the younger son of, a wealthy family or something similar. And so the golden age resolved that financial question by those means. The Rabbi Small books, I thought, which I really enjoyed, they were very popular, I don't know, 30 years ago, whatever it was. But again, the rabbi, I mean, he was being paid by the community that he served. So if he wandered off into investigations, he didn't have to worry that he was taking bread from the mouth of his wife and children, whatever. So I do like that about Sam and Nikayla, that they can be pro bono. Now, on their way, they have acquired allies in the same building, actually, but I really enjoy the law firm. So that must have been a lot of fun for you to create and write.
Yeah, it was, I needed an attorney in the second book, and that was called The Fitzgerald Ruse, which involved F. Scott Fitzgerald's time in Nashville. And so, this often happens, that a character comes in to serve a specific plot purpose and winds up hanging around. And he's Hewitt Donaldson is kind of early 70s, former kind of hippie lawyer, big on defense, big on proving letting his ego be nurtured by getting people off as a defense counsel, and they partner up on a lot of cases. And it's interesting because Sam and Nikayla are in their 30s, early to mid 30s. Hewitt's in his 70s, kind of in some ways plays a role of a father figure for Sam, even because of the generation difference. And he brings in his own history with Asheville. So that's a character that I think is in the new book, Fatal Scores, in the book I'm working with. It's kind of like, once he's in, you try to find ways for your ensemble cast to play meaningful parts in each story.
So you also have, as you really need to, a guy from law enforcement who wanders into Blackman's coffin and has never gone away.
Right, because and there's usually an antagonistic relationship between the police and the PI, and Sam does something to prove himself to his friend Newley, who's the police homicide detective, by finding out who murdered his partner. And so there's an indebtedness that goes between the two of them, a respect that goes between the two of them. And Sam, being a chief warrant officer and having his own investigation, appreciates what Newley does. So I have conflict in the book. I don't have too many just mean characters. Just they have their flaws, they have their quirks, but basically they're a good group of people that you sit around the bar and have a couple drinks with, a couple beers with, and share stories.
I don't know that one could actually say that there's such a thing as a good-natured murder mystery, but in point of fact, well, they're cozies, but that's different. But I do think that you're wonderful on procedure. You're very logical. You're even if we wander around in the end to get there, you've proceeded to it in a logical way. So it isn't really, everything's there. It's just a matter of how you put it together. That makes a difference. But you've been very good at developing an ensemble cast. You've been very good at describing the community and putting surprising things in front of readers. So it's really been a joy to work with you. I have enjoyed every book we worked on together.
Well, thank you. That's been about 17 of them.
Has it been that many?
Yes.
Well, because we've left out there, 2 or 3 thrillers, in addition to Barry, in addition to Sam. Mark every once in a while thinks he's going to write a thriller or a spy story or something, but and so you've done a couple of those, and you have one I think that you haven't quite finished.
Right, and that story is actually, it's being under consideration now by the publisher, but I got the idea from that on a trip back from Scottsdale. That trip I made December 2019 when I was able to be there in person, which I really miss being able to be there in person. I flew back to Charlotte, and the woman sitting beside me was going on to Washington, and we started talking. And she was going to see her great aunt who lived in her house in Washington, D.C. that she was born in. And she was in her mid to late 80s. And she said, we don't worry about her because she rents out her rooms to Secret Service agents and FBI agents who are in town on temporary duty. And I thought, now that's a very interesting house. She said, we don't worry about it because there's always somebody in there who is armed and knows how to defend themselves. And so I took that character and embellished her with her own skills and traits to sort of I like to think of her as if Ruth Bader Ginsburg had gone into law enforcement, active law enforcement. What kind of feisty character would she be? And so that's kind of the basic summation of who Ethel Fiona Crestwater is, and hopefully she'll make an appearance at some point.
Wow. Yeah, she's a really interesting character. So before Patrick pops up to join us, we haven't really talked about your own professional background. So before or while you've been a writer, what else have you been doing?
Well, my career has been in broadcasting, and I go back to the days when there was no cable TV and your local station did everything. And so I came out of the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, with a degree in English and radio, television, motion pictures, and was a producer director for the CBS affiliate in Charlotte for a couple of years, and then went to Washington with the ABC affiliate. We were up there during Watergate. It's where I met my wife. And I guess one of the highlights of that era was that I was the director for the pool feed for the local stations the night Nixon resigned. So I was down on the White House lawn when all that was happening. And so it was almost like the last couple of months have been deja vu in some ways about what's going on. And now I do a lot of independent work, video work. I do a lot of work with the Children's Hospital here in Charlotte, with families that have got children who are in treatment, and their courage and their resilience and all those stories. And I love writing my mysteries and doing those things. But when you're sitting with a family whose child has relapsed and is having to go through chemotherapy again, or I've filmed a heart transplant on a 4-month-old baby, it helps ground you. It helps you tell you where the real drama is in life, and what you can do to try to ease other people's pain and tough times that they may be going through.
Well, I think your own character and your own service does definitely infuse the characters that you write, because they're really good guys and good women. You know, the women are important as well. And maybe it's one of the reasons I so much enjoy your books is that you are, except for the obligatory villain, and even some of those are not really thoroughly bad guys. They're guys that screwed up or made a bad decision, or life hit them at the wrong moment, that kind of thing. But anyway, let's call Patrick. Ariel, we now call him, coming up from the deep. There he comes. Don't you love it? It's just magic the way this happens.
Wow.
I've been enjoying listening to this conversation. Let's see, as far as actual questions, I only have a few, but Carol makes the comment. She just says, I really enjoy listening to both series. When the pandemic started, I re-listened to all your books. So are you happy with the audio book versions?
I am. I was fortunate enough when Poison Pen made the arrangements with an audio publisher for some of the books that I was able to talk to the narrator. And we went through some words. I'm an audio listener, book listener myself. And so whether it's a phony Southern accent or a New England accent or whatever, sometimes the narrator can really make or break the story for me. And I've been pleased with those choices for my books, and the fact that people are willing to let me say this little town looks like it should be pronounced this way, but it's actually pronounced another way, and so that no one else is kind of yanked out of the story by hearing something that just doesn't ring true.
Right. Boy, speaking of the pronunciation thing, I've always said Moog, so that's completely changed. Yeah, Moog, that's the right way to say it?
That's the right way to say it, but like Barbara said, nobody's going to believe you're right.
Yeah. Well, I'm actually really interested in reading this book because Moog was a pretty fascinating character, wasn't he? I mean, didn't he start out building theremins?
He did. In the first chapter in the book, the national anthem is played on a theremin to kind of introduce people into Moog and his invention. And to me, it sounds like, kind of growing up in the mountains, it sounds like an old timer playing a saw. I don't know if you've ever heard a guy play the saw, but it's that same sort of still wobbly, weird kind of sound, except it's electricity passing through your body. So, and Patrick, they make kits of them, so that's something that sounds like a good project for you.
It might be. I actually watched the fascinating documentary on theremin, himself, and and a lot of people, of course, they know how the theremin was used in a lot of the Bernard Herrmann soundtracks and a lot of the spooky, but also wasn't it in the Beach Boys' Good Vibrations?
Oh, could be.
Yeah.
Hey, I'm gonna have to go listen to that now.
You know that part that goes,
Okay.
That's a theremin.
All right, gotcha.
Yeah. We digress a little bit.
I wish you had told me that before I finished the book. It would have been a nice cultural reference.
Yeah. Let's see, LJ Roberts. She asks, and you may have already addressed this, but will Sam ever have a case that takes him out of the area?
I think so. I would like to have his perspective on some other area and broaden the case. It's a question of it being the right thing. He's wandered around in the area, but if he came to Scottsdale or something like that, where I could come research with you guys, I think that would be a fascinating.
Wait, I have to add, he's licensed to practice in North Carolina. I'm not entirely sure what his legal status, but he could be on vacation somewhere and, be brought in as a consultant, but I don't know that he can formally operate as a PI outside North Carolina.
That's a good point. We'd have to explain that away, that he knowingly was breaking the law, which would put some extra tension into the whole thing he was investigating. Tell LJ to send me some ideas, Patrick.
Well, LJ's got some other good ones here. And she asks, will Barry Clayton ever reappear?
I would hope so. I've got focused on the Sam book and the new character book, and that's a question of also having a discussion with the publisher or a publisher about Barry coming back. But I think he has a niche, and he has a contribution to the mystery world that I think should not be abandoned.
And finally, she asks, how would you compare Sam to Robert Galbraith's, aka J.K. Rowling's Cormorant Strike character? Are you familiar with that character?
Yeah, I am, and it was interesting because he lost a leg as well. I think that book came out a couple years after my Sam Blackman series started. I've liked the books that I've read. I would compare him. I think he's a darker character, moodier character than Sam is. Sam has got his dealings with his loss, and he's a little darker than my Barry Clayton. But in comparison to, I think, to Stryker, he is a much more kind of serious-minded, moody character. Fascinating character. She writes great characters, obviously. But that's what I would say is the difference.
Right. Actually, just a follow-up question of my own about the music scene in Nashville. It's such a kind of a world-famous center for folk music and ethnic music of all sorts. Are you pretty immersed in that at all?
I am, and I like to have that infused in the books in some way. I don't know that it happens as much in Fatal Scores, but in Murder in Rat Alley, the family that was suspected and became victims of a murder plot had a band, had a family band, and then there's a pub there called Jack of the Wood that has jam sessions, and come East, Patrick, and bring your theremin, and we'll book you in someplace.
A lot of bluegrass music there, and
yeah, bluegrass, mountain music. My favorite band at the moment is the Steep Canyon Rangers. I don't know if you're familiar with them. They play with Steve Martin, and they're a great band. Take a listen to their tracks. But the music scene is very much a part of the Asheville vibe. Friday nights, I don't know, things with COVID have changed, but they had a drum circle where several hundred people would come down with djembes and conga drums and whatever, and be in the park and just play for hours with dancing and everything. So it's just the vitality of the town is infused in everything from the food to the music to the mountain traditions. And it's an interesting place because you have the locals that I would call the natives whose families have been there in the hills for generations. You have the retirees who come there for their second home, now becomes their permanent home. And then you have what I would call the crystal people who are there for the vortexes. Now I know you've got that in Sedona, which probably beats our vortexes all to heck, but that's part of the charm of counterculture life and they're all in those several city blocks of street musicians and.
What's the housing market like there? Is it expensive place to live?
Expensive. It's expensive.
Expensive. Yeah, I used to go to Asheville playing bridge tournaments and all long time ago when I lived in the South. I mean, me in the South is an oxymoron anyhow, but while I lived in the South, which I left in 1986 and have not regretted, sorry, Mark, but then I wasn't in North Carolina. It was not as good where I was. Asheville was relatively inexpensive. And I can remember friends in Asheville, for example, who never would consider having air conditioning. And as we were dying of, at like 99 and raining, I said to them, you're going to really have to rethink this. But it was it was much more laid back, much more. The retiree thing has really changed North Carolina and Eastern Tennessee and Southwestern Virginia, which they had lots of vacant land. Those lakes had not turned into entertainment centers. People hadn't moved in to buy big create lakeside estates with boats and create country clubs and all. They brought a whole culture that is not native. And just like in Santa Fe or Aspen or Scottsdale, they rocketed up real estate prices to the point where natives can no longer really afford them. Or, Patrick, what's happened to our horse culture here in Scottsdale? I was driving up Cactus towards Mayo the other day, and there was a beautiful ranch that I think might have been Arabians and all. And now it's gone, and there's a homeowner, a developer putting in a set of homes and so forth. And one by one, the ranches and the horse farm have fallen to increasing.
Be all up around Cactus and just north of Shea and all that. You're right. A lot of that's been.
And I mean, it's the same dynamic all over, but it certainly has been true of Asheville as well. Mark, remind me, where is Appalachian State? Is it actually in Asheville or is it?
No, it's in Boone. It's in Boone, North Carolina, which is probably about an hour or so away. And that's grown into a big university.
It has. But now you've got, so you've got more of a university atmosphere, even though it's not the college town. They're close enough.
And UNC Asheville plays a role there as well. So it's got those elements as well. I think you're absolutely right about the real estate prices have gone sky high, and what, just like in Scottsdale, who gets hurt are the teachers and the firemen and the law enforcement officers.
That are forced. I mean, you can really see it in Santa Fe. My husband can wax on about that forever because Santa Fe became a playground for rich Texans and Californians, and just wiped out the ability of locals to live there. But the other good news is sometimes places like that begin to decreased because the beautiful people that went there and discovered them don't like being discovered. And so when they start bringing in the Greyhound tours and so forth, they move on to somewhere else. And then the price level kind of readjusts. Scottsdale is more of a living community. It isn't just a tourist community. People come here and they actually want to live here, which is different than if you're going skiing in Aspen and want a second home or that kind of thing. So it's different. But and I think in Nashville, there are plenty of people who want to live there. So it's not going to just revert.
No, and they want to invest in the community. They want to invest in the arts. They want to invest in the healthcare and those things. So it's, I don't mean to paint a disparaging picture of it, other than the reality of the fact is that the real estate prices have gone up, I think.
Yeah, but that's, and actually, thanks to the pandemic, that's happened all over the country.
Right.
Absolutely. Mark, just a quick question about the, your character deals with some environmental issues and things of that nature. Were some of your literary influences, I keep thinking of writers like Jim Harrison and, Wallace Stegner and people of that nature. Who were some of the writers that kind of have inspired you?
Well, as far as mystery writers, I think environmental things have primarily been through on the ground, reading about things, living through that, being in a small town that was adjacent to a paper mill that's more personal than other writers. Mystery writers, I really like Michael Conley's work. That just seems to be always top notch. Barbara and I were talking earlier about David Rosenfeld and his characters and one of my favorite writers and someone who was very good to me and wrote some nice things about me was Margaret Maron, who passed away last month. So I was sorry for her loss.
And bless her heart, I don't know if you read it. I thought it was so Margaret. I mean, I've known her forever and I'm very, very fond of her. She wrote her obituary on the day she was dying because she died of a series of strokes. She didn't drop over from a heart attack or something, but she could see the end coming. She actually wrote her own obituary.
Right, and like all of Margaret's writings, it was very nice.
It was. I read it, and she was a wonderful author, and she's one of the few authors I know who really felt that she had said everything she had to say about the 2 series she had been writing, and called a halt to it. And it's possible that she felt. I know she said to me, "If it won't, I can't do anything of the same quality, and so it's better if I stop."
Mm-hmm.
But I also wonder if, now knowing that it was a long series of strokes that eventually killed her, because it was in 2016 at Malice Domestic where she won. I sat at the same table with her. Laurie King won one of the teapots. I got one for being old, lifetime achievement, and Margaret got the other one. I think Laurie won for best historical novel and Margaret won for best novel. It was her last Secret Herald book, which is not, as you know, a North Carolina book, but sort of. Anyway, I think that's when she said that to me. So I would not be surprised if she didn't feel like.
But she had a wonderful body of work. And I think the Deborah Knott series, there were 20 in that. And I think she said in her obituary that after 20, she really didn't know. The way she put it was there was nothing else to explore with that character as far as.
Well, The Bootlegger's Daughter was a remarkable start to a really great series. And like you, she wrote about different things in North Carolina. I mean, she had one about the furniture industry and Hickory or whatever it is. And she was down on the shore and she used a judge as her viewpoint character. So that was an interesting perspective. But the judge, just like your guys, the judge hooked up with an actual law enforcement person. So you can hardly get away with that in a long running series. Somebody has to have the power of arrest. It just works out.
That's true. Yeah. And the other thing you have to deal with is, what do I do with Sam and Nikayla as far as romance and the future of them together? I mean, that's something that's kind of in the back of my mind about.
Well, it takes on new dimensions, given the last 4 years and the current climate in terms of both Black Lives Matter and white supremacy and all. They are in a much more difficult place than they were when you wrote the first book, 7 Black Man's Coffin, some years ago. Patrick, is there anything else?
Yeah, let's see here. There was one, let me see, from, okay, hi from Tammy and Greg. And they ask, how did you find that piece of baseball construction trivia?
Oh, they're talking about, and say hi, Tammy and Greg, and Greg is a musician as well. I know Greg and Tammy. I was looking at the Babe Ruth connection, and one of the characters has collected baseballs, and with Lou Gehrig's and Babe Ruth's signatures on them, and there was something about the baseballs that cast doubt on their authenticity. And I didn't know that until I was just sort of Googling, the research engine of authors, instant expertise, and found out some things about the construction of baseballs that could date baseballs as to when they were manufactured. And that's the fun part about writing, is you discover these little things along the way. You go down rabbit holes and come away with maybe a little piece of information you wouldn't have known otherwise that can work into the story and maybe have an impact on the story.
Good point. Well, Mark, it's really been wonderful to catch up with you. Patrick, am I cutting you off at this point?
Not at all. LJ has a final suggestion. She said you could team up with you could have your character team up with an investigator here in Arizona. That sounds like a damn good idea, LJ.
That's right.
It really does. See, that's one reason to do these events, is you can get plot points and other information.
Always on the lookout for them. Well, thank you for having me. I've enjoyed it as well as I always do.
Well, it's always been a treat to visit with you, Mark, and to read your books. So I'm going to really look forward to the Sam and Nikayla manuscript. It'll be a treat coming. Meantime,
hold this up,
which is just now published, I think is a truly wonderful addition to the Sam Blackman series. And if you've never read the Sam Blackman series, I'm trying to remember whether they're all available at the moment. I think they are, but anyway, go back and start with Blackman's Coffin and work your way forward, because they are really wonderful books. And sometimes people talk about regional mysteries as sort of a disparaging way, but I consider it to be an enormous asset that you get to read a series that is set in a place that may not be familiar to you, or maybe one you'd like to visit, but you haven't gone there. And you really get to know. It's like going on vacation, and instead of driving to a new place every night, you actually settle down in some hotel in some town and spend a week. It's a whole
real insider tips and information. Social.
Yeah, it is. And Mark is such an informed guide, Patrick, that, you think Parker in Boston, you think of Laura Lippman in Baltimore, you think of, Michael in Los Angeles, whatever, Dana in Alaska. I think that the landscape and the character and the author kind of get fused together, and the landscape becomes just as important. I'm reading Ann Hillerman's new manuscript, for example, and she's gone so far off the reservation. She's in the very large array over near Socorro, over in eastern New Mexico. And I thought, well, how fun is that? I love spending time. So you would enjoy it after you found out about the NASA station and all the rest of it. And formerly it was a satellite tracking station, right?
Yeah, it was for the Apollo.
Up for Apollo, right?
Mission.
So, who knows? Nashville NASA and all the rest of it is influencing our lives. Well, I could go on forever, so I'll stop. Thank you. Thank you very much. It was wonderful. Patrick, have a great evening, and talk to you soon. Bye.
Thank you, Patrick.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Good night.
Thank you for watching too.